Today's lecture is the final one for Week 3, and the second in which we'll consider the use of military force to prevent or end massive violations of human rights. In the previous lecture, we discussed the concept of humanitarian intervention, multilateral and unilateral, and the rules regulating it under the UN Charter. Today, we'll focus on the emerging doctrine of the responsibility to protect. We'll talk about the evolution of the doctrine and its application in practice with a specific case study of the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, Sudan. Let's begin with a discussion of the evolution of the R2P doctrine, and in particular its conceptual foundations. Now, this takes us right back to the very beginning of the course when we discussed the principle of state sovereignty. The traditional approach to sovereignty was to view it as a right or privilege that a state enjoyed that would screen or prevent external scrutiny of that state's behavior within its own borders, even when that involved violating human rights. The humanitarian intervention concerns of the 1990s and 2000s led to a shift in that conception of sovereignty from a right to a duty or an obligation to protect the people living within a state's borders from widespread human rights violations. If a state did not fulfill that obligation, then it would be the international community's response to step in and protect the individuals whose lives were imminently at risk. So this is quite a substantial change in what was a centuries-old international legal norm of state sovereignty. Well, what brought that change about? Well, some of the catalysts included, as mentioned in the previous lecture, an increase in humanitarian interventions in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and a concern that the Security Council might be either unable or unwilling to authorize such interventions when they were needed. This concern came to a head in 1999 when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization bombed Serbian forces in the Serbian province of Kosovo to prevent widespread human rights abuses threatened against the province's ethnic Albanians. Now, this was done by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, without the prior authorization of the Security Council. And the intervention, the bombing, did in fact stop the humanitarian crisis from occurring. It also led to the independence of Kosovo from Serbia against that country's wishes. And it raised broader, and I would say really existential issues among government officials, policymakers, and international law scholars about how to think about humanitarian intervention in light of the Kosovo bombing. So there was a need, in other words, an understanding of a need to reassess the traditional approach to humanitarian intervention. And that is what led to the responsibility to protect doctrine, because I think most observers were of the view that the humanitarian intervention in Kosovo was unlawful under international law because it was not authorized by the Security Council, but it may well have been legitimate. And the separation between legal rules and legitimate conduct was very troubling. And so one has to understand what the catalysts were in order to evaluate the doctrine. And I can think of no better source for you to understand how the doctrine came to be and what its content is than the article, an excerpt of which I've given you, by Gareth Evans, who was one of the intellectual authors of the responsibility to protect. So if you haven't already done so, please click on the link on the Coursera webpage, review this excerpt from Gareth Evans' article, and then continue the lecture. Let's begin with a discussion of the content of the responsibility to protect, or R2P doctrine. The doctrine began as, and may and likely still is, soft law. And we've discussed soft law previously in the course. It's an international norm that is phrased in legal language and aspires to shape behavior, particularly of governments, but that does not in itself create a legally binding obligation. Now, it may be that soft law, if it's widely and consistently followed by states and eventually accepted as obligatory, can evolve into customary international law. It can also be codified in an international agreement or treaty. Neither of those things, I would say, has happened yet, although it may be that such a principle is emerging, although in fits and starts, as we will see. So that's one aspect of the content of the R2P doctrine. Another aspect of the doctrine's content would be thinking about how it operates in practice. When, in other words, does the responsibility to protect lie with the state concerned, and when does it lie with the international community? According to those scholars and policymakers advocating for the responsibility to protect doctrine, there were essentially three levels of responsibility. The first level would lie with the host state, that is, the country in which massive human rights violations were either occurring or at risk of occurring. If the state was unable to act, it would be well advised to work in partnership with the international community to prevent those violations from occurring. And if it was unwilling to act and repeatedly refused to do so, then the third level would be triggered, and that would be a responsibility to protect that existed and lodged with the international community. Another component of the R2P doctrine, which is discussed by Gareth Evans, are the 5 legitimacy criteria. And these criteria are put in place to attempt to both narrow the circumstances in which humanitarian intervention under the guise of R2P would be appropriate. That is, you can't do it for a pretextual reason or for self-aggrandizement. It should be done genuinely to stop ongoing or imminent widespread human rights violations. It should be a matter of last resort when other mechanisms to attempt to prevent those violations or stop them were unsuccessful. And the measure itself needs to be proportionate and have a reasonable chance of success. These legitimacy principles are designed to serve as restrictions on when intervention would occur that might be alternatives to the kinds of limitations that we studied in the previous lecture involving the voting rules and institutional mechanisms of the UN Security Council. Now, one thing I will say that the R2P doctrine, as described so far, does not address is who makes the determination about the tiers of responsibility and about the 5 legitimacy criteria. Is that only done by the UN Security Council, or might it be done by individual nations or by a regional grouping of states? I'd like to defer addressing that issue for a few minutes while we turn to a situation in which the UN Security Council did respond, and we'll see whether it responded adequately. This is the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, which we previously studied in connection with the international crime of genocide. And if you will recall some of the very basic facts from the Darfur crisis beginning in the spring of 2003, both government forces and militia forces known as the Janjaweed were attacking ethnic African tribes in the Darfur region in western Sudan and engaging in a variety of widespread human rights violations. These were quite well known by the spring of 2004. So how did the international community, in specific the UN Security Council, respond to this? And was this response adequate? Well, I'll give you just a brief overview of some of the actions that were taken by the UN Security Council during this time. The establishment of a commission of inquiry to assess the facts, the imposition of travel restrictions and asset freezes on some individual perpetrators of the violations, the reference of the situation in Darfur to the International Criminal Court, and finally in 2006, the authorization of a UN peacekeeping force, which was then expanded in 2007 to a force of 25,000 peacekeepers that had a significant regional presence from African Union forces. The situation continued in 2008 and 2010 with the ICC issuing arrest warrants for the Sudanese president. Now those have not, in fact, been executed, in part because of resistance of both the Sudanese government and other countries that have been unwilling to detain the president and to transport him to the ICC's headquarters in the Netherlands for prosecution. I think it's fair to say that today, after a decade or more than a decade, the humanitarian crisis in Darfur remains unresolved. It is certainly true that the humanitarian crisis the immediate killing has diminished, but the effects of the earlier violence remain, with the United Nations estimating some 4.2 million people as being war affected, and some 2.5 million Darfurians displaced, and casualties in excess of 400,000 individuals. So this is quite, I would say, a very mixed response. That is, there was the deployment of peacekeeping troops. They may not have been adequate to deal with the situation, and there was also an attempt to involve international criminal bodies in prosecutions while the atrocities were still ongoing. That raises the question of how we ought to evaluate the application of the R2P principle in Darfur. And I want to commend to you this statement by Gareth Evans, whose article you've previously reviewed, where he essentially says that the response to the crisis in Darfur has been from the outset and remains less focused and effective than it could and should have been. So he has quite a critical view of the United Nations response, but he does say that it's really only after the crisis started that the R2P principle was first recognized. So as a result, some of the delay in responding might be due to the delay in the evolution of the norms. That said, I think it's also a concern about what ought to be done in response to a humanitarian crisis that is evolving over the course of years. Is it better to have some incremental pressure through sanctions and threats of force rather than an immediate use of force? What about the legitimacy criteria we talked about before? How would they be satisfied in the context of Darfur? And I invite you to go back and look at some of the criteria for the R2P principle, both the 5 legitimacy factors and also the 3 tiers of responsibility, and to think about whether it might have been appropriate for an individual country or group of countries to move more quickly than the Security Council did, and what risks might be associated with that sort of approach. Let's now turn to a couple of other different situations in which there were responses, both perhaps adequate or inadequate, to humanitarian crises. And I think it's here in the application of the principle to specific contexts that we will determine whether the R2P principle remains as an aspiration or actually evolves into binding international law. Here you see 2 examples, contrasting examples, one involving Sri Lanka in 2009, when the Security Council did not adopt any resolutions relating to violence against civilians at the end of a civil war in that country, and in 2011, when the Security Council did authorize humanitarian intervention, specifically, by the way, invoking the R2P principle in response to an uprising against the Gaddafi regime in Libya. The NATO bombing there, unlike in Kosovo, was in fact authorized, but it did more than protect civilians. It also ultimately helped to secure regime change by the rebels that were resisting the Gaddafi government. And that has led to a number of significant concerns by some states, in particular Russia, but other states as well, that this might not be a principle that was capable of being confined or restricted in a way that would preserve international stability. So most recently, the ongoing civil war in Syria, beginning during the spring of 2011, has resulted in widespread violence and human rights violations against civilians, and yet we have had no intervention authorized by the Security Council. That's because Russia has vetoed proposed resolutions which would have authorized various sorts of humanitarian intervention. Now, we got very close to testing whether unilateral intervention would have been permitted under international law. It was certainly threatened by the Obama administration without Security Council authorization, but that threat was removed after Syria had agreed to destroy its stockpile of chemical weapons. So we don't have, I think, conclusive determination as to whether the traditional view of humanitarian intervention under the Charter has prevailed or not. And this leads us to the final issue I'd like to discuss with you today, and that's future challenges to the responsibility to protect principle. Specifically, who decides whether a state is or is not discharging its responsibility to protect, and if it's not, whether military intervention is justified. That's really the key question. Will it be a decision that is continues to be confined to the Security Council, or will other nations be able to make that determination? The risk and benefit exists on both sides of the equation. And I simply want to show to you here a very pointed statement from Gareth Evans in the readings that I assigned to you, where he says that it's quite a dilemma as to which of two evils is the more serious. One where the international legal order is damaged as a result of bypassing the Security Council, or if there's widespread killing of human beings where the Council stands idle. What the authors of the responsibility to protect principle were attempting to do, I think it's fair to say, was to increase the pressure for Security Council action when the legitimacy criteria that I mentioned were met. It was hoped that by articulating a doctrine that had those criteria, that it would create an incentive to act on behalf of all members of the Council, including those P5 veto holders. As we now see, some few years on after the development of the doctrine, that has not yet occurred. And so this is one of the very challenging areas of international human rights law, both its legal dimensions and its political dimensions. Here are a few additional sources that you might wish to consult regarding the recent applications of the R2P principle, and they go into far more detail regarding other humanitarian crises than is possible in this brief lecture.